Chapter 14. Shenner Marsh. We arose early the next morning to begin our search for the village of Shenner Marsh. From what Bourne had said, we knew that it was somewhere south along the western foothills of the Codish Mountains. Hopefully we would come upon it if we continued in that general direction. "I've heard of Shenner Marsh," offered Vosh as we packed our things in preparation for our journey. "Why do you want to go there?" "That's our business," stated Kirill. "What do you know about it?" I asked. "Can you tell us where it is?" "I believe it's a couple days south of here," he confirmed, "but I don't know why anyone would ever want to go there." "Why?" I persisted. "What's wrong with it?" "Haven't you ever heard of its history?" Vosh asked incredulously. "I thought everyone knew of Shenner Marsh." "Humor me," I requested. As we walked, Vosh told us what he knew of the town. Many years ago, Shenner Marsh was a village like any other village in Terrace, and was one of the main 5 that made up the southeastern arm. It was a natural gathering place because of its proximity to the Fale River, and because it was along one of the common routes through the Codish Mountains. There was nothing special about the village until about 60 years ago. At that time, a mysterious plague hit the town, and many of the residents became sick. Word of the plague spread quickly, and soon the village was fully quarantined. No one went in, no one went out. Then one day, at the height of the plague, a strange and sinister-looking giant appeared in the town. He said he was a wizard and that he could stop the plague, but it would come with a cost. Desperate to try anything, the town elders asked him the price. "The blood of your youngest resident," was the wizard's shocking reply. Horrified, the residents argued about what to do. They didn't know who the stranger was and loathed his wicked demand. And yet, some reasoned, the child was sure to die anyway, along with the rest of them, if the plague continued. Finally, in their madness and desperation, they agreed to his conditions. A baby had been born just prior to the onset of the plague. She was the only child of a beautiful young woman, the daughter of the village chief. Everyone had loved both her and her newborn child, and so it was with great sorrow that they took the child from her and offered it to the wizard. The young mother screamed and wept bitterly, but the town closed their ears to her. The wizard placed the child on a stone altar, and with a crooked and evil-looking blade, killed her. Her blood ran over the sides of the altar and onto the ground. As soon as the blood touched the earth, the wizard began to laugh. His garments and flesh fell away to reveal a terrible beast with huge obsidian eyes and sharp dagger-like teeth. It was an Ugraya, a terrible creature of nightmares that feasted on death. Its laughter grew and began to multiply. From the edges of the town, other creatures just like him began to walk towards the altar, cruelly joining in his revelry. As they approached the stunned villagers, they began their killing spree. When they were done, the plague had stopped, just as promised, but not one person was left alive. The Ugraya vacated the town, leaving behind a slew of corpses. It is said that those murdered residents still inhabit the village. When night sets in, they wander through the streets, crying out in their guilt and despair, never finding rest. I was deeply disturbed when he was finished, and I could tell by the look on both Kirill and Bog's faces that they shared my shock. "What is so important that you have to go there?" finished Vosh. "We're looking for something," I answered. "It is hidden somewhere in the village." "What is it?" Vosh pushed. "None of your business," interjected Kirill. "Well, it's fine by me," countered Vosh. "I don't ever want to go near the place. I'll show you where it is, but I'll wait for you outside." We marched quietly for the rest of that day as we mulled over the information that Vosh had given us. Every once in a while we would run different plans of attack past each other, but none of them seemed sufficient. No wonder Bourne wouldn't talk about the location much. It sounded like something out of a nightmare, and if I could have, I would have avoided it. But it was there that Bourne had hidden the second stone, and it was there that our paths led. The second day was much like the first, a steady trudging along the side of the Codish Range. We talked a bit about who and what the Ugraya were, and if we had to be on the lookout for them as well. Vosh had little information about them, except to say that they were whispered about sparingly, with great trepidation, and were seen even less. But then he said something that had all of our attention instantly. "Even the Foatin are afraid of the Ugraya." Bog stopped in his tracks. "What do you know about the Foatin?" he asked. Vosh looked from Bog to Kirill and myself, and then back to Bog again. He must have sensed the intensity of our interest, because he answered with a sober question of his own. "Have you encountered the Foatin?" "We have," I answered for the brothers, knowing the pain they were feeling. "Tell us what you know." "Do you know who Korath is?" Vosh asked. When we nodded, he continued, "And have you heard of Dek and the Dane Roshea?" Again we nodded in affirmation. "The Foatin were led by Korath's descendants, As you probably know, Dek was in charge of protecting the Dane Roshea. He chose several other giants to help him in his charge. The Guardians, Bog offered softly. Yes, continued Vosh, curious as to Bog's apparent affection for the name. The Foatin were Korth's answer to the Guardians. Their mission was to seek them out and gain control of the Dane Roshea. Forever they have been foiled in their plans, yet still they exist and tirelessly pursue their goals. They are a powerful and merciless group and will stop at nothing to accomplish their mission. Their official leader is Omeg, Korth's grandson, but he is very old. The real leadership is held by his ruthless son, Tama. King Pelt had always been wary of the Foatin. He opposed their efforts by not giving them the freedom they desired to carry out their malevolent campaign. This has not stopped Tama, however. He has a force of several hundred giants at his command, and they carry on with their wickedness in secret. He was one of the first to make contact with the newcomer, Jack, and having recognized Jack's obvious power, allied himself with Jack's purposes. This information was very disturbing. Jack had 5 of the 8 stones that made up the Dane Roshea. Tama must have learned of this from Jack, which would explain their quick association. That increased Jack's power immensely and made the force against us even more formidable. It seemed that the more information we got, the more impossible our undertaking became. Kirill's silence throughout this explanation confirmed to me that he was feeling the same despair I was, his indomitable spirit at last taking a severe blow. But Bog would not relinquish his courage. "One day at a time," he said again, holding up his thick index finger. "One day. We will worry about the Foatin when the time comes. Now we must focus on Shender Marsh. We will be there soon." I nodded at him in appreciation. It wasn't that the upcoming visit to the devastated village was all that heartening. It was that he had seen beyond it. It wasn't going to be the last stop on our journey. We would face whatever was there and overcome it, even if overcoming it meant coming face to face with the Foatin. Kirill seemed to shake off his foreboding as well. We continued on for the rest of that day. As evening approached, Vosh pointed to the valley ahead. "Shender Marsh is in that valley," he said. "We camp here then," I added. "I don't want to be down there at nightfall, and if we start early tomorrow, we'll have as much daylight as possible to search." We set up camp and prepared some dinner. We were near enough to the Fell River that Bog and Kira went to fetch some fresh water. We bedded down early in anticipation of a long day ahead of us. Though I couldn't be sure, I thought that I heard the faint moans of many voices carried to us on the wind from the direction of the valley. The sound sent a chill down my spine. I glanced over at the others to see if they had heard it too, but it appeared that either they hadn't or they weren't going to admit it, for fear that admitting it would make it more true. We awoke shortly before sunrise and had a quick breakfast. Not completely willing to trust Vosh, yet wanting to be as unencumbered as possible, we left him with our things at the campsite. "We should be home before sunset," I told him. "If not, well, then you may be on your own." The sun rose with a cheeriness that belied the frightening challenge that lay before us. We headed down into the valley, taking nothing with us but our weapons and a bit of food. We talked very little, each of us focused solely on the task ahead. The trail meandered haphazardly into the valley, as if there was nothing ahead to be cautious about. At last it emptied into an open area, and we had our first glimpse of Shender Marsh. It was a tiny village, at least what was left of it. Broken down stone buildings, graying in their age, sat like old and forgotten toys left by careless children. Streets ran out in random patterns from a central open area. Shops and other places of business were surrounded by cottages and small farms, like guilty prisoners huddled before a judge. The gloom radiating from the town was palpable. It looked like no one had been there since the awful day 60 years ago. "Where do we start?" Kirill asked grimly. "Splitting up doesn't seem all that desirable, but we will search 3 times faster if we separate." I agreed with his assessment. "Besides," I added, "it's daytime. As long as we're out of there before it gets dark, we should be okay. It's just an old deserted town." "Let's meet back here before dinner," Bog said. "There's no sense in pushing our luck. If we haven't found the stone by then, we can come back tomorrow." Having agreed on that plan, we roughly divided the town into 3 sections and commenced our search. I was given what appeared to be the main street, and I moved in its direction with no small amount of foreboding. The first building I came to was an old store. The roof at one end had collapsed and the door was slightly ajar. I stepped up onto the porch that ran the whole length of the building's facade. It moaned in protest but held my weight all the same. I pushed on the door, which swung in noisily on its rusty hinges. Cobwebs dominated the interior of the building, and I was accosted with the musty smell of old rotting wood. There was nothing left on the shelves. which led me to discredit my earlier assumptions that the town had been unvisited since its devastation. Looters and treasure seekers must have made their forays into the village, but what happened to them while they were here was anyone's guess. If they had succumbed to the fabled villagers' ghosts, I couldn't tell, but I didn't want to join them. I did wonder what the chances were that the stone was still here, and yet I sensed in my heart that it was, and so continued my hunt with hopeful expectation. The building's simple construction only had one floor, so my search of it was quick and efficient. There wasn't much of anything to find. There were no back rooms or locked compartments. I stomped around on the floor and tapped on the walls, but there were no secret hiding places. The building simply was what it was. As I looked, I imagined who the people were that lived here. Were they really so different than me? Sure, they made a reprehensible decision to give in to the Ugraya's demands, but they were desperate. Could I not have done the same thing? I thought about what happened back in the valley where I killed some of the Foatin. If you had asked me before then if I could ever kill someone, my answer would have been an emphatic no, but the circumstances had propelled me in that incomprehensible direction. Is that what happened to the people of this village? I couldn't judge them. In fact, the longer I searched, the more my heart went out to them. I left that building and continued on to the next one. It was much like the first, and my investigation proved to be similar both in execution and in discovery. This went on from building after building. Some were larger than others, even with second floors, and my efforts required more time. My empathy for the citizens grew, as did my discouragement at not finding the elusive second stone. It was around the middle of the afternoon when I finished searching the buildings on the one side of the main street. I had just started on the other side when I heard a loud crash from the area in which Kirill was looking. "Kirill!" I yelled. Not hearing a response, I called again. Bog came lumbering around the corner from his section of the town. We both looked at each other and then hurried off in the direction of the crash. "Kirill!" I called the third time. This time I was rewarded by a groan from a large building to our right. It had 2 floors and was clearly the biggest building in the village. Bog and I hurried up through the front door, which stood open. We entered the building and paused just long enough for our eyes to adjust to the light. Soon we could see that there were 3 or 4 rows of benches coming out from each wall. They all faced towards the center of the room. It must have been some kind of meeting place. The familiar smell of dust and wood filled the air. On the back wall were empty shelves, some of which were broken and hung like lopsided grins. But what grabbed our attention the most was the gaping hole in the middle of the room from which came the pained groan of our missing companion. I laid my sword down on the floor and carefully crawled to the edge of the hole. There, about 15 feet down, lay Kirill. I could see his head and shoulders as they protruded from a pile of wood that had almost all but buried him. One heavy beam lay across the whole pile and held it firmly in place. Kirill painfully opened his eyes as he heard me above him. "This was not what I intended to happen," he said sarcastically. "What did happen?" I asked, concern riddling my voice. His answer was choppy, as it was interrupted by spasms of pain. "The floor looked weak, but I still thought it would hold me. I guess I was wrong." "Is anything broken?" "I'm not sure. I know the floor up there is, but I don't suppose that's what you're asking about." "How do we get down there?" "Well, don't come down my way." "Hang on, we'll be right there." I crawled back to Bog and told him what I had seen. We quickly searched the perimeter of the inside of the room, looking for some access to the lower level. When we couldn't find any, we went outside, walking in opposite directions, circumnavigating the building. Our fruitless search left us both very confused. But then I noticed a little building in the back that appeared to be some type of shed, and I was reminded of the secret passageway that Toll had constructed in our house back in Corna. I ran to the structure and sure enough found a trap door in the floor. After opening it, we saw a rough-hewn ladder that led downwards. At the bottom, there was a tunnel. Without hesitation, we descended the ladder and followed the tunnel, greatly relieved when we entered the basement. Kirill couldn't see us from where he was lying, but we could see him. We went over to where he was and began to pull the rubbish off him. The first task was to move the beam. After a bit of pivoting, and with Bog's immense strength, we were able to carefully shift it enough so that we could eventually roll it off the pile. The rest of the removal followed quickly, and before we knew it, we were able to help Kirill to his feet. By some good fortune, nothing was broken, though he was definitely sore. He indicated that with some assistance he should be able to exit the building. It was now quite late in the afternoon, and the light that was coming in through the hole above us was significantly less than earlier. Gingerly, we helped Kirill over the pile of debris and headed towards the tunnel. Just as we reached it, we heard a sound like a loud bang echo down the tunnel. At first we didn't register what it was, but then Bog shouted, "The trap door!" I left Kirill with them and hurtled down the tunnel. It was dark, darker than it should be. The reason was all too obvious. When I reached the end of the tunnel, the ladder was gone, and the trapdoor was shut. Someone had closed us in. I hurried back to where the brothers waited and informed them of what I had discovered. Bog, being larger and stronger than me, went to try his luck with the opening. I joined him in his futile efforts, but even with our strength combined, we couldn't open the trapdoor. If I had my sword, we would have been able to free ourselves, but I had left it on the floor above us. We returned moments later, shaking our heads in failure. Coming back to the pile of rubble that stood in the middle of the room, we reasoned that if I climbed onto Bog's shoulders, I should be able to reach the precarious rim of the hole through which Kirill fell. If I could get out, I could hopefully either reopen the trapdoor and drop down the ladder, or I could find a rope or something with which Kirill and Bog could climb out. We proceeded with the plan, but as I climbed up on Bog's back, I could see that the sun had all but set. And as if that realization wasn't enough, there came through the hole a cry so eerie and forlorn that I dropped back to the floor and looked at Bog and Kirill in dismay. The fear I felt about where we were and what was about to happen was mirrored in their eyes as well. Night had come, and Shender Marsh was about to reveal to us its long-hidden and deadly secrets.